This is Professor Michael Chapman. I'm one of the most experienced IVF doctors in Australia. I believe that an important part that I can contribute is to educate patients in relation to fertility, infertility, and all that involves. These series of podcasts help to educate you. I hope they are helpful to you. If you wish to know more, however, I'm more than happy to have you contact me via email, which is profmchapman@gmail.com, or make an appointment to see me on 9138 4222.
Could you talk about emerging techniques like an in vitro gametogenesis, IVG, and compare that to traditional IVF?
The world moves forward scientifically, there's no question of that. In relation to creating artificial eggs and sperm, we're a long way from that. In a laboratory scenario in mice, there have been some successes. In terms of achieving that in a human, I think we're still decades away from that. I don't think that we're going to we may end up being able to improve fertility using artificial gametes, but there's a whole lot of issues, both ethical and scientific, to be overcome before we get to that point.
Have you talked about international regulations and how they impact the availability and accessibility of cross-border IVF treatments?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon that country to country there are variations in what's acceptable and not acceptable around the what some people consider ethical boundaries of IVF. So let's just run through Australia and how we rank compared with the rest of the world. Basically, in Australia, you can do all of the standard techniques of IVF to create embryos using donor sperm, donor eggs, donor embryos. That's all ethically acceptable, assuming that the patients are counselled appropriately and appreciate what they're doing and how potentially the child might be affected by being a donor or a donor recipient. So that's Australia in terms of most things. Surrogacy in Australia is legal, which is not the case in many countries around the world. But the restriction in Australia, as it is for things like blood transfusions and sperm and egg donations, there can be no inducement financially to be a surrogate. What can be paid is what's termed reasonable expenses, which one particular court case in Queensland probably set the benchmark at around $25,000 for a woman for the inconvenience and time off work of carrying a baby for somebody else. But therefore, it is not very common for women altruistically to come forward and carry a child for somebody else. Mostly in Australia, it relates to friends and relatives, and being prepared to do that for their friend or relative. When we look internationally, there are places where you can go for surrogacy where commercial arrangements do occur. In the United States, in a number of the states of the United States, it's legal, and you can go there, take your gametes or embryos and create embryos either here in Australia and ship them there. That's legal. Or create the embryos in America and go through the IVF cycle there, transfer them to a surrogate, and the child is born in the US and brought home. There are significant legal hurdles to get through, to get the Australian passport, for instance. It's all doable, but it all costs money. Most recently, I've looking at a couple of the American sites. You're talking somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000 American dollars to get surrogacy. The other thing that Australia we are banned from doing is gender selection. So we can do genetic testing on embryos. That's legal, totally legal, to check that the embryo that we're about to put back is genetically normal, which increases the chances of success of that cycle if you're putting back a genetically normal embryo. At Life Fertility in Sydney, we offer that service. What we can't do, and the laboratories are banned from doing, is in looking at the chromosomes, the 23 pairs of chromosomes. Obviously, the X and the Y are one of those 23 sets. And so the laboratory does know what the sex of that embryo is, but they are banned from telling the clinics or the patients what the sex is before we put an embryo back. As soon as the embryo goes back inside, we can actually ask the lab to release that information. And so as early as 2 weeks after a positive pregnancy test, you can find out whether it's going to be a boy or a girl. But you can't do it beforehand. It's a debatable issue that we can't do gender selection. I have a personal view that for something called gender balancing, in other words, if you've got two children of one sex, I think it would be very reasonable for you to go forward for a third one, knowing that you can decide it's going to be the opposite sex. And I'm sure there were people would go for a third child if they knew they could make sure it wasn't the same sex as the previous two, or worse, 4 boys or whatever, or 4 girls. Now, you can get around that not in Australia. You can create embryos in Australia, or you can go somewhere where that gender selection is legal. The closest place to Australia is actually Hawaii, and the American system, Hawaii and the west coast of California, allow gender selection. You're probably looking, in addition to the travel costs, something in the order of 25 to 30,000 Australian dollars. And many couples in Australia are electing to do that. We certainly, from Australia, we do have probably hundreds of couples either going internationally for gender selection or surrogacy, and the other area is donor eggs. Again, we can't pay donors in Australia. It's legal, but again, altruistic egg donation doesn't happen. Whereas many countries around the world, Greece, Spain, South Africa, and America, you can pay donors. Even in the United Kingdom, the donors can receive 2,000 Australian dollars to go through a cycle where they will donate their eggs to another woman. In Australia, we don't have any of that, and so many women can't find a donor in Australia and go internationally. Increasingly, we're importing eggs from those countries, but there are strict guidelines, and it varies from state to state, but there are strict guidelines as to what that donor how she has to be screened before she can become a donor in Australia. That starts with a counselling session or 2 with a counsellor who is registered in Australia as a fertility counsellor, called an ANZICA counsellor. So even international women around the world, if they're going to have their eggs coming into Australia, have to go through that counselling session. After that, they will have genetic testing to look for the whole variety of potential mutations that can occur. So that genetic testing is then essential, and then all the infection screens to make sure that they don't have Hep B, Hep C, HIV. And it's a fairly rigorous process, but eggs can be brought into Australia, and we at Life Fertility in Sydney are offering that as a possibility so patients don't have to travel internationally.
And don't forget that you can access all the previous episodes by going to our website www.theivfjourney.com and select IVF Journey podcast from the navigation menu.